thanks for showing up here as well. Highly interested in hybrid intelligence. Looking for a plug-in yourself, maybe. I'm definitely going to sort of volunteer myself here. But some of that may be hype, so we'll discuss that further. Who had the first question? So inspired by what's happening on stage, some of the questions there. I'm sure some of you may have questions on how this works or when it's coming or what the opportunity is. Let me know. Who? Show of hands. And there's a mic that's coming your way then.
Who has the first stone?
Oh, there's no. Oh, of course, because it's an unorganized.
That's the first thing you're trying to do. Either are you saying?
So I guess I am the one with the mic right now. So.
He without saying the first two.
Hello.
It's working.
So my question is more on the technical side of things. Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned Marvin Minsky and so on. And I know there was this debate about whether artificial intelligence should try to mimic the brain or it should have like a totally different structure. And then, you know, multiple disciplines evolved from the two types of thinking. I guess one of them is reinforcement learning and so on, where we don't try to mimic the structure of the brain. And we also have like deep neural networks where it's kind of, you know, an imitation of the brain. You know, and my question is, what are your thoughts on this debate where I guess you stand on the mimicking the brain side, but what do you think about the other side? Thank you.
Right. So what you described is a classical problem whether intelligence as a manifested apparatus is an overlay of procedures on the brain or is a production of the brain. Would you agree that's the premise that you're starting from?
I guess it's one way to phrase it, yes.
Right, so it's a paradox. Is it an apparatus that is it a byproduct of the existence of that GUI structure? Knowing about the geometry of the brain, you're talking basically something that has got you know, small geometrical elements that is not in conformity to any shape known to mankind. It's got dendrites and Puton sites in tens of thousands and overall density 10 to the minus 16th, which in theory should make it look like steel rather than a GUI thing. You see the first paradox? It defies a very physical structure that it represents. And now, is that an apparatus of intelligence that is manifested and created as a byproduct of the existence of his brain, whether it was created by God or created by nature or created by itself, right? It still does not answer the first principle. Why does it defy the things that we live by, these laws of physics and the rules of mathematics that we all agreed to as scientists and whatnot, yet we have something that defies it every day in so many different ways, and I just mentioned one way. Yeah.
I think he's asking about cognitive architectures.
So yeah.
Okay.
The cognitive architecture is a manifestation of us overlaying something on how the brain works, like neural net and so forth.
Yeah. So you know, it's been a while since I wade into this space, but the general challenge was: do we make the intelligence look like a brain, or do we model it like a brain, or do we model the brain like an architecture? You know, when we start looking at how things work for a computer and the rational ways that they do and the things that computers do better in many ways than human brains do we model this and say, this is a computer and we recognize that we're not going to use a biologically inspired cognitive architecture, we're going to go through this process, or is the biologically inspired cognitive architecture what we're trying to reach towards? Are we trying to be the human brain, or are we trying to exceed it in some way by leveraging the capabilities of the computer?
Right.
And so that's kind of the debate I think you were going for. right?
Yeah, in the same sense that, mechanical muscles are like engines, which do not look at all like, what we in nature, how muscles evolved. And it's kind of like the same question about brains, intelligence.
And I think we went initially, everybody wanted to go toward, initially because it was easier. They stayed in computer programming languages, tried to build architectures through drawing boxes that said, here's my sensing, my reasoning, I'm going to do this. And then they ended up with these recursive loops they couldn't explain. They were trying to figure out how that went. So they said, well, maybe there's something in biology that's going to make us give us this answer. So then we started, like Dr. Howard also has an MD in neuroscience, as well as PhDs and all the rest of this stuff, because he started going, well, gee, if this is going to be the case, maybe I should understand it better. And we're still looping, everybody is still seems to be wandering around that hole of what can we learn from the brain that we can put into this space?
Yep.
And I think that's where this brain-computer interface piece that he's been involved in is, let's figure out how brains communicate and see if that electric signal could be put into a computer and if the information from a computer could be translated in some way into the brain in some symbolic or sub-symbolic method. And I think that was, you had a paper on that, a particular brain code or something, I can't remember.
The brain code, the fundamental code unit. That is true. I think that philosophically speaking, intelligence as a phenomena itself has not been well answered or defined. That we can frock out intelligence from a rock based on archaeology of how long and all the shapes and the different things that happen. But we tend to kind of like, with what we know little, try to marry that to something that we know little bit more about, not as much, probably still just as little, and then see if the two together can give us an answer that is better than what we have. And that's what we're working with today in intelligence and in the computing world. Computing is not done to perfection, and not at all, far from it. Otherwise, machines would be programming itself and reaching a level of general intelligence faster and better and safer than what's being described. So.
Are we close to, I think we're at least touching on the subject now. I don't know if we're close to an answer for you.
It's not like I know the answer, so.
Maybe people have a question?
Hello, thank you. Hello, Professor. I have kind of two questions. First of all, my first question is related to neuromorphic technologies, and where do you think that sits on the hype cycle right now? Is it overhyped, underhyped? Is it going to be a major technology in the future? Is it close? What do you believe about that? And then I will follow up with my second one.
It's
okay.
my opinion, because I know the people and had some privileged information on some of the chips that referred to as neuromorphic, that it is at the pinnacle point of hype. It's, to specifically say that computation intelligence is limited to cognitive architecture or to neuromorphic architecture is to not give any justice to how broad and deep the whole concept of intelligence. So neuromorphic, for those who are not familiar with it, is essentially an architecture that led to a chipset led by Intel, knowing the Loihi chip. And the Loihi chip takes spike train and other data that comes from the neurons and try to organize and make sense of them such that it gives meaning to what the neuron is generating as a language. It failed to deliver that, but it sure produces multi-layer neural nets that are faster than any. It sure helps solving problems that in complex spaces. So it advanced certain things, but in itself is not. That's what happens. Every time somebody comes up with something new, they get all excited and psyched up and think that's the solution for all. It is not the solution for all. Intelligence equals life. And life is very complex phenomenon.
I mean, one of the things that I think is, obviously I'm not an expert in that space at all. So I'm not going to answer that question. What I am going to say is that one of the challenges for me, and we try to explain, working in an intelligence field, people living in a cubicle, classified information that's not shared, as analysts, they're not as strong as someone that has high context. In other words, someone who's lived abroad, understands the world. Well, why is that? We talk about intelligence. The examples I use are really simple. You're in a tent in the field, you're producing an operations order of 40 pages, it's 1980 something, the computers have little pages, have little holes on the sides, printers go gig, 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 and all of a sudden the major comes in and says, oh my God, we're out of copier paper, what are we gonna do? And all these other college-educated majors run around, what are we gonna do? And this young sergeant walks over to the computer paper, rips the edges off and goes, will this work? Okay, who's the most intelligent person in the room? Not who's the most educated. So it has to do with how people use things and the context of the environment. So a lot of times when we start worrying about artificial intelligence and the rest, I've often thought, looking at this challenge that, we just keep adding more sensors. And that's a lot of the way that, we're looking at the future of artificial intelligence is as they link, you get, what's that thing in Matrix? The TV, if you have enough computers linked together, then maybe they have enough sensors to vaguely replicate the phenomenon that is the human brain. And since we have human brains, that's probably why we're biased towards thinking that's the thing everything should be modeled on. I mean, it's anthropomorphic, which is classic for science. So.
Maybe a question on my very related to this is the world of technology is quite wide and convoluted, right? There's so many technologies and many of them develop in an exponential fashion, which is, again, hard for the brain to grasp, but it's computational science is definitely one of those exponential, but sensors, as you mentioned, even different programming languages are there, processors are being developed, new materials are being developed. There's so many technologies that also influence this space. Are there any key technologies that you feel like, okay, we need to watch that space as well? Or you say, you know what, yes, we realize that sort of the whole context is also developing exponentially and this is why we're sort of entrained in it?
To me, at least in my interest, I anchored into an object that happens to embody the phenomena of intelligence more than any other object that I can think of. And that object is the brain. And happened to learn that this object has conditions that are suboptimal, known as diseases. And my interest is to bring it to an optimal operating condition so that I can see actually how it works or how it used to work, right? Historically speaking, we think that used to be, monkeys and then became human. I actually have the complete opposite philosophy. I think a human used to be super intelligent creature with capacities endowed that we haven't even ciphered yet. And this isn't just quacky ad hoc talk. There are scientific evidence that when you look at the cell structure, the neuron structure, you find things like Puton sites or Aspen sites or these type of things that looks like this is a very sophisticated computing apparatus that was sitting here and has been ignored for millions of years. Why? What did it used to do? What was the function of this? We anchor into a default network and we think that we discovered the whole brain, and when we discovered very little about it. Long story short, so to me, it's about bringing this machine into its optimal working condition. Once we bring it into its optimal working condition, and I'm talking that's beyond my lifetime, that could take 100, 200, 300 years from now, that we see human back at the dignified level that it used to be, and not intertwined and fixated with the silliest things that are out there flashing before their eyes, then human at that point will be how do you say it, opportune to actually learn what is the phenomenon of intelligence. I'm not thinking about something that we can solve in 2 or 3 discussions or a few volumes of a book. I'm talking about a question that will remain with us for as life itself exists.
So in order to get to where he wants to go, which is what I thought your question was, there's some emerging technologies in BCIA, right? Nanobiocognitive information systems out there. We see these technologies are going to have an impact as they come about on making that possible. Nanotechnology, we start seeing these small enough that you could insert things, instead of just going external, you could insert things and control them at a level where, it wasn't so invasive. It could be in the brain fluid or something like that. All of these things are going to make a big difference. On top of that, we are getting ready to have a tsunami that could make things like a singularity occur. It's 5G communications, it's democratized manufacturing, it's 3D printing. Again, we start talking about these chips and talking about printing and things that could be biologic, that could be accepted within, our antibodies and all the rest of those kinds of things that attack, immune systems that attack things that could be put into the body. We're going to see advances in those spaces. And I also think, some of the things they're doing right now with RNA, and we did this over the COVID virus. Well, we've learned about CRISPR and those things. Who says that the components of the computer have to be metal? There's a lot of things out there that I think that we're starting to really understand much better that will have huge impact on, again, this is hype. It ain't been built yet. You specifically asked for something that is not truth. But yes, I think the trends indicate that this is going to speed up faster and faster. You probably saw me doing this earlier. It's not sign language for sign language. The idea was things are just getting faster and faster. So when people tell me, oh, he was at the MIT Mind Machine Lab, and everybody remembers Marvin Minsky back then with the frames and everything else early in the 60s, and then it just stalled, boom, right? Well, all the other things hadn't come into place yet for those things to work. And as these things speed up, then that's when we're going to start seeing, getting a better idea of where we will end up. And the question is, are you afraid of speed?
Yeah.
And that's one of the challenges out there, because we are literally afraid of speed. There are more and more science fiction things coming up that say, don't do this. You're playing with God. You're playing God. This is the new nuclear weapon. So hopefully, as we observe these technologies, we'll be able to influence the idea of how to get them in the right place without having them be misused. We remember, I was a director of visual security products at Intel Corporation. When the internet was built, it was just between universities. And I was there. My dad taught at Harvard and MIT in information science. Little phone thing in the house, There's only 60 universities around the world that were actually sharing information. Nothing was digitized. There was no security. Why? Why would a professor do anything bad intentionally? So everything was built around that paradigm, and then boom, bad things happen. Well, as we come into this space, it's time that we start realizing every time we've done this, something bad has happened. So, I'm a cynic, and B, I'm not totally against the idea of regulating some of this development. Because if we just assume everybody's going to have this, kind of higher level dream of augmented humanity, no. There are people who are going to try and take advantage of it to dominate other human beings in very painful ways. Okay.
Okay. Guy in the middle there. Yeah.
This is yours?
Yeah, I think so.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. My question is, how far are we and how feasible is it to integrate biological and artificial intelligence, either through brain-computer interfaces, nanotechnology, or anything else? Thank you.
It's done.
Yeah.
You're actually thinking about it as the future. While 12 years ago, we took 5,000 neuron cells in a petri dish tissue sample, and we wired that with an F-16 simulator to fly an F-16, essentially, like a pilot. And crashed, a few times, and then before you know it, it was flying better than a pilot. And that was 12 years ago with actual biological. So it
So
became...
you're saying an airline pilot only uses 5,000 cells?
Probably less than that. Probably less than that. You know, if it's done, if it's used optimal, depending on how the functioning of the network and the gates and the distribution of that gate, then you could actually do it with less neurons than this.
That doesn't mean they're going to do it.
Yeah.
You know, so for instance,
Yeah.
for a very long time, we've had planes that are capable of auto landing. We really don't, that's a very controlled environment relative to driving vehicles.
Yeah.
And usually when you land really safely, it's the pilot let the plane do it.
Yeah.
And when you land hard and yank it up, he was in the Navy and thinks he's getting yanked up on an aircraft carrier and didn't want to let the plane land. Because the bigger planes now are, you know, they've been able to do that for years, but humans don't trust. It's all about trust in us, that tool to just get them safely on the ground.
So the art of the possible, it exists. It's been in existence for a while. The question is whether it's overall feasible. From a scientific point, I tend to think of the regulators and there's like a team behind me that's extremely noisy and loud and rowdy, and I just keep looking ahead. The reason why you couldn't use that, for example, is because you cannot have these neurons live for longer than 90 days. And the process of 90 days started was limited for a number of days, and it kept growing based on the environment that you create for them. Today, we have materials that are not phagocyzed by the brain, not rejected by the immune system, that you can actually use it to grow neural scaffolds, neuron bridges, optical bridges for people to restore sight. So that exists. That actually is feasible today. Computational-wise, you can do an enormous amount of computing cluster inside the brain. So I can isolate an area like the STN, subthalamic nucleus, and use that as a computer from inside your brain. And then let it do things like manipulate your movement, dance against your will, move opposite direction to your conscious mind, and do some really crazy stuff. But
So also, you know, a lot of these advances are not cheap, and you know how we are with drugs, right? You know, the company spends a ton of money to develop the drug, and then you've got a lot of people out there that'll never afford to be able to afford to pay for that drug as they're trying to recoup their losses from the discovery.
Yeah.
And so while all these things are feasible, you know, who's going to be able to pay for it? Yes, we can have commercial flight to the moon, but I can't afford a trip. You know, I mean, so we've got to kind of figure out how that's going to go in that space as well. You know, how is this going to get funded? Because moonshots, like I said, in academia and government, you know, moonshots are something that there's no money in yet, so that's great that it gets done. But until somebody figures out how to monetize it, it doesn't explode. It doesn't. There's no incentive to make this available to everybody, to make it universally applicable. So yes, these things are feasible, but do I think they're truth yet? Not really, because so many things could go wrong on the way to the, you know, cup and lips thing. Yeah, whatever that cliche is.
I think we're through time, but I still see hands of questions, and yeah.
Questions are key for successful futures.
Okay, one more.
Thank you, guys. Very thoughtful. David, I'm glad you brought, or maybe you did intentionally or unintentionally, the MIT labs here. But the current head of the lab at MIT is actually a person who was born in this city here. That's one thing. Her name is Daniela Rus. Second of all, I'm glad to see the DC metro area community here. I'm from George Mason University representing here, so very nice meeting you and see you here. My question is related to some work that I'm not really sure that you guys do, but I'm curious if what is your perspective on the impact of people's faith? So it's like an ethics and AI development, and what is the role, or how you see this, so you can comment on the role of people's faith in developing artificial intelligence.
So
Thank you.
So again, there's bound to be obstacles. I'm sure someone out there is going to write a great novel, about the divide between spirituality, the mind and the machine and the mind kind of thing, and all the rest of that sort of thing. But in general, in the United States, not only an open pluralistic society where we've got lots of religions, but also we're pretty much a nation of merchants. So if there's value in it and someone can make money on it, it's much more likely to be successful, and faith will be an issue than just don't buy it. It's kind of the same argument people have made about different kinds of, this offends me on the billboard, then, or don't, on a billboard, no, but I mean, if it's something that you have to click on to go look at, well then, that's on you, don't look at it. So I think that in some cases, this is not going to have a huge stopping effect. I don't see legislation, at least in our country, going against this, especially if it's marketable, because the tech community has massive political strength, and it's always tech first, and then depends upon the ethics of the group that are building the tech, not necessarily the external groups.
But so do the religious community.
Right, so is the religious community embedded in Silicon Valley? I don't think so.
It's a different religion.
Yeah.
I'm afraid the next Q&A session is about to begin. So, with respect for the next speaker, thank you very, very much. This was very, very clear. Thank you for the question.